In medieval Europe, death was rarely quick. For those who defied kings, betrayed the church, or threatened the established order, execution became theater, calculated, ritualistic, and designed to destroy not just the body, but the very memory of the condemned. What follows are 6 deaths that shocked witnesses, sparked rebellions, and revealed the brutal machinery of medieval justice. The Drawn Traitor, August 23, 1305. Westminster Hall, London. William Wallace stood before English judges in chains. For years, the Scottish rebel leader had evaded capture, becoming a symbol of resistance against Edward I's occupation. Now, at 35 years old, he faced trial for treason, a charge he rejected, arguing he had never sworn allegiance to the English crown. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence was not. Wallace's punishment was designed as political theater, a warning to anyone who might follow his example. What the English called hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for the worst traitors, and Wallace would experience every horrific stage. The execution began at Smithfield. Wallace was lashed to a wooden hurdle and dragged behind horses through London's cobblestone streets. The rough surface tore at his back and limbs. Crowds lined the route, some jeering, others silent. This brutal procession was merely the opening act. At the execution ground, Wallace remained conscious, exactly as intended. Executioners hauled him up on the gallows, the rope tightening around his neck. But before he could suffocate, they cut him down. Survival at this point was not mercy. It was calculated cruelty. What came next required Wallace to be fully aware. As he lay gasping on the ground, executioners stripped him naked. With practiced precision, they cut open his abdomen. His intestines were extracted slowly, methodically, foot by foot. These were immediately placed in a brazier and burned while Wallace watched. The smell of his own organs turning to ash filled his nostrils. The executioners reached deeper into the abdominal cavity. They removed his heart and cast it into the flames as well. Wallace's vision began to fade. Blood loss and shock were finally releasing him from consciousness. But the spectacle wasn't finished. With Wallace now dead, they severed his head with a single axe blow. His corpse was then butchered into 4 quarters. Each piece would be sent to a different Scottish town: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as a warning against rebellion. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where it would remain for years. Edward the Fine believed this barbaric display would extinguish Scottish resistance. Instead, Wallace's execution transformed him from rebel leader into martyr. The brutality of his death became a rallying cry that would echo through generations. Murder in the Cathedral, December 29, 1170. Canterbury Cathedral, twilight. Archbishop Thomas Becket prepared for evening prayers, aware that danger was approaching. Once King Henry II's closest friend and advisor, Becket had become his greatest antagonist. Their conflict centered on a fundamental question: who held ultimate authority in England, the Crown or the Church? Becket had recently returned from exile, but the tension remained unresolved. Days earlier, Henry had unleashed a frustrated outburst in front of his knights. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 men took these words as command rather than complaint. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton arrived at Canterbury as twilight fell. They first confronted the 52-year-old archbishop in his chambers, demanding he submit to royal authority. Becket refused. The knights retreated briefly to arm themselves with swords. Monks urged Becket to hide or bar the doors. He refused both suggestions, proceeding instead toward the main altar. He would not turn his church into a fortress. The knights burst through the entrance, their chainmail rattling in the sacred silence. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king?" they shouted. "Here I am," Becket replied, standing near the altar steps. "No traitor to the king, but a priest of God." The first blow struck his shoulder. Becket staggered, but remained standing, refusing to cower. The second sword connected with the side of his head. Blood poured down his face. "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church," Becket said, his voice steady, "I am ready to embrace death." If you value this kind of detailed historical storytelling, please consider liking this video. It helps us continue documenting these forgotten moments. The third blow was devastating. A sword struck with such force that it sliced through Becket's skull, the blade shattering against the stone floor beneath him. The crown of his head was severed. Blood and brain matter spattered across the altar steps. A final thrust pierced his fallen body, the sword tip breaking against the pavement. One knight placed his boot on Becket's neck and scraped brain matter onto the cathedral floor, declaring, "This traitor will never rise again." But he was wrong. Within 3 years, miracles were being reported at Becket's tomb. Within 5, Pope Alexander III canonized him as a saint. Canterbury became one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites. Henry II himself eventually performed public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's shrine. The blood on the cathedral floor had created a saint. The favorites fall November 24, 1326. Hereford, England. Hugh Despenser the Younger understood he was about to die. For years, he had been King Edward II's closest advisor, and almost certainly his lover. He had accumulated enormous wealth and power, making countless enemies among England's nobility. When Queen Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer invaded England, Despenser's fall became inevitable. Captured while attempting to escape by sea, the 40-year-old was brought to Hereford for what could hardly be called a trial. No defense was permitted. The sentence reflected not just his crimes, but years of accumulated hatred. The execution began with ritual humiliation. Despenser was stripped naked and dressed in a tabard painted with his coat of arms reversed, the heraldic symbol of treachery. A crown of nettles was placed on his head. Tied to 4 horses, he was dragged through Hereford's crowded streets, the rough ground tearing at his exposed flesh. At the execution site, still fully conscious, Despenser watched as executioners prepared their instruments: knives, fire, ropes. He was hung from a gallows 50 feet high, but deliberately not to death. The rope was cut before his neck could break. As he gasped for breath, they laid him on a table. What followed was methodical destruction. First, they removed his genitals with a knife and threw them into a brazier before his eyes, symbolic punishment for his sexual relationship with the king. Then, they cut open his abdomen, slowly extracting his intestines and other organs. These too were burned while he watched. His stomach heaved, but there was nothing left to vomit. Witnesses reported an inhuman howl as executioners cut out his heart and cast it into the flames. Despenser's eyes remained open, somehow still showing awareness even as his life drained away. Only then did they behead him. His head was mounted on London Bridge. His body quartered and displayed in Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle. The execution of Hugh Despenser was not justice. It was revenge, performed in public as entertainment and warning. Blood on Sacred Ground, February 10, 1306. Greyfriars Church, Dumfries, Scotland. John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, entered the small church believing he was safe. Known as the Red Comyn for his auburn hair, he was a powerful Scottish nobleman and Robert Bruce's rival for Scotland's contested throne. Bruce had arranged this meeting, suggesting they discuss Scotland's future. Both men left their swords outside the church, respecting the sanctity of holy ground. No blood had ever been spilled within these walls. As they stood before the high altar, their conversation quickly turned heated. Bruce proposed they unite against English occupation. Comyn refused, reminding Bruce that he had sworn an oath to King Edward I. According to some accounts, Comyn threatened to expose Bruce's plans for rebellion. Bruce's face darkened. Without warning, he drew a dagger from his belt and drove it into Comyn's chest. The blade penetrated deeply, but did not immediately kill. Comyn fell to his knees, blood seeping through his clothing onto the church floor. He staggered away from Bruce and collapsed near a side altar. Friars rushed to his aid, dragging him toward the altar to administer last rites. A trail of blood marked their path across the stone. Bruce, shaken by what he had done, retreated outside. There he encountered his companion Roger Kirkpatrick, who asked what had happened. "I doubt I have slain Comyn," Bruce admitted. "Then I'll make sure," Kirkpatrick replied. Kirkpatrick entered the church with Christopher Seaton, Bruce's kinsman. They found Comyn still alive, receiving comfort from the monks. Without hesitation, they fell upon the wounded man with their daggers, stabbing him repeatedly. Comyn's uncle, Sir Robert Comyn, rushed to intervene and was cut down as well. The Red Comyn died on consecrated ground, his blood staining the church floor, a sacrilege that would haunt Bruce for the rest of his life. The Pope excommunicated him. The stain on his soul, many said, could never be washed away. Yet within 2 months, Bruce had himself crowned King of Scotland. The murder in Greyfriars Church, rather than destroying his claim, became the point of no return that launched his rebellion. The Boiling Betrayal, August 31st, 1375. Scotton Manor, Lincolnshire. William Cantilupe retired to his bedchamber, believing himself secure. The 29-year-old nobleman had dismissed his attendants after evening prayers. The heavy wooden door was barred. His household staff seemed loyal. As midnight approached, Cantilupe was awakened by the sound of his door being forced open. In the dim candlelight, he recognized 3 servants entering, men employed by Thomas Laverell, Richard Goose, and John Cook. These men had plotted against their master for weeks, driven by greed and old grievances. Cantilupe reached for his dagger, but the assassins were already upon him. The first blade struck between his ribs. He cried out, but the thick stone walls muffled his screams. A second knife plunged into his abdomen, a third into his throat. Blood poured onto the bed sheets as Cantilupe fought desperately. For nearly 2 minutes, the attackers continued their assault, delivering more than a dozen wounds. His struggles gradually weakened until he lay motionless, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. The servants confirmed he was dead, but their grim task was not complete. The calculated cruelty of these medieval deaths raises questions about justice, power, and public spectacle. What do you think motivated such extreme brutality? Share your thoughts in the comments. From the kitchens, they brought a cauldron of water that had been heating over the fire. With methodical precision, they poured the scalding liquid over Cantilupe's wounds. Steam rose from the corpse as the boiling water sealed the gashes, preventing blood from seeping through wrappings during transport. It was a murderer's trick, ensuring the body could be moved without leaving a trail. They wrapped the corpse in linens, the body still warm not from life, but from the cruel treatment that followed death. They carried Cantilupe's remains from the manor under cover of darkness, intending to dispose of the body in a location that would implicate others. By dawn, the plotters had vanished, leaving behind only blood-stained sheets and the lingering smell of copper and steam. The crime was eventually discovered, but the calculated nature of the murder, the boiling water, the careful disposal, revealed a chilling premeditation that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. The hour of agony, March 28, 1757, Place de Grève, Paris. Robert-François Damien stood on a scaffold in front of thousands of spectators. The 42-year-old former domestic servant had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV 2 months earlier, inflicting only a minor wound with a small knife. For this act, he would endure a punishment so horrific that witnesses would recount it for decades. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the execution began. Damien's right hand, the one that had held the knife, was burned with sulfur. His flesh sizzled and blackened. The smell caused spectators to cover their noses. Damien's screamed, but this was merely the beginning. Executioners stripped him naked and secured him to a specially constructed table. With red-hot pincers, they methodically tore flesh from his thighs, arms, and chest. Into these wounds, they poured a prepared mixture: molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and melted wax. Each application brought fresh screams that echoed across the square. Damien's remained conscious throughout. Physicians periodically checked his condition, not to ease his suffering, but to ensure he remained alive to feel every moment. Spectators reported that he continued speaking, sometimes begging for death, sometimes calling out to God. After these tortures, executioners attached thick ropes to each of his limbs. The other ends were tied to 4 strong horses, each facing a different direction. At the signal, the horses pulled. Damien's joints stretched and dislocated, but his limbs did not separate as intended. For 30 minutes, the horses strained without success. The crowd grew restless. Some turned away. The executioners, growing impatient, used knives to cut into Damien's joints and tendons, severing the connective tissues manually. One by one, his limbs were torn away. He was still breathing after losing both arms and one leg. Only when the final limb was removed did Damien's suffering end. His torso, still showing faint signs of life, was thrown onto a pyre and reduced to ashes. The entire execution had lasted over an hour. King Louis XV had wanted to make an example of Damien's to show what happened to those who raised hands against the monarchy. Instead, the execution's extreme brutality shocked even hardened Parisian crowds. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire cited it as evidence of judicial barbarism. The spectacle did not strengthen royal authority, it began to erode it. Within decades, the very monarchy Damien's had attacked would be overthrown in the French Revolution, and public execution by torture would be abolished. The Pope's humiliation, September 7, 1303. Anagni, Italy. Pope Boniface VIII awoke to shouts and the clash of weapons in his birthplace and papal retreat. The 73-year-old pontiff had been engaged in a bitter power struggle with King Philip IV of France, even threatening to depose him and excommunicate the entire French kingdom. Now Philip's men, led by Guillaume de Nogaret and Italian allies, had breached the papal residence. Hearing the attackers approaching, Boniface did not flee. Instead, he donned his full papal regalia, the mantle of St. Peter, the imperial crown, and sat on his throne holding the keys of St. Peter and a cross. "Since I am betrayed like Christ," he declared to his attendants, "I shall die as Pope." The attackers burst into his chambers, finding the Pope seated in full ceremonial dress. For 3 hours, they hurled insults and threats, while Boniface remained silent and motionless, refusing to acknowledge their presence or authority. Then, Sciarra Colonna, whose family the Pope had persecuted, struck Boniface across the face with a mailed gauntlet. The metal-covered fist crashed against the elderly man's cheekbone and temple, drawing blood. It was an unthinkable act, striking God's representative on earth. The attackers imprisoned Boniface in his own palace. For 3 days, he received no food or water. Witnesses reported seeing Nogaret repeatedly slap and humiliate him. When finally released by the citizens of Anagni, who drove out the attackers, Boniface was no longer the commanding figure who had once declared himself above all earthly kings. Returning to Rome under guard, Boniface showed signs of deterioration beyond physical injuries. He experienced periods of confusion, slurred speech, and seizures, symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury. His cheekbone remained visibly deformed where Colonna's gauntlet had struck. For 5 weeks, his condition worsened. He developed high fever and became increasingly disoriented. In lucid moments, he spoke not of revenge, but of the humiliation he had endured. A pope, God's representative on earth, struck like a common criminal. On October 11, 1303, attendants found Boniface in his bed, rigid with eyes open, having apparently suffered a seizure during the night. The Pope, who had claimed authority over all earthly rulers, died alone, his face still bearing the mark of Colonna's blow. These 6 deaths span 2 centuries and 3 countries, yet they share common threads: the use of violence as political theater, the deliberate infliction of suffering as deterrent, and the transformation of execution into public spectacle. Medieval justice was not designed to be quick or humane. It was designed to be seen, to be remembered, to instill fear in anyone who might challenge authority. Yet paradoxically, these brutal deaths often achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Wallace became a martyr for Scottish independence. Becket became a saint. Bruce's sacrilege launched a successful rebellion. Even Damien's horrific execution helped fuel Enlightenment opposition to torture. The spectacles of medieval death revealed not the strength of authority, but its fragility, the desperate need of those in power to make examples of those who defied them. These deaths were meant to be warnings. Instead, they became rallying cries. If this exploration of medieval justice moved you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more historical documentaries that uncover the brutal realities behind the legends. Thank you for watching.